Thought we'd start with something really interesting. I have this picture in my office, and I thought about that this week as I was thinking about Jonah before we read. But this was, I think Solomon was about 2. We were still living in High Point up that way, Trinity, North Carolina, and I guess probably all of us probably have this picture of our own child somewhere probably that has done this same thing, but you can imagine what has happened. We turned our back for a moment, and Baby Powder and Solomon met each other in his bedroom, and we came in, and it's everywhere, and he's caught, and he's in a mess. Now, I want you to understand, here's what I see when I look at this picture. I don't see the mess. I don't. Whenever I look at this picture, I don't see the mess. I don't see the baby powder. I don't see the things scattered in the background. Here's what I see. I see the wonderful, amazing, uncompared to grace of the living God. That's what I see when I see that picture. Because you see, I see a child who was once in a dark place in a country or somewhere around the world, abandoned and left alone, and left in a place. He first left at a home, then left at a police station, then put in an orphanage, and now he's in our home, spreading baby powder everywhere. I want to tell you something. That is the picture of the grace, the wonderful, marvelous grace of God. And when I think about that, I think about sometimes in our lives get really messy, don't they? How many of you have found yourself in a mess recently? Can I put both hands up? And sometimes our messes don't look near as clean as this mess. That's baby powder. That's an easy thing to deal with. But some of the messes that we end up in, they can be really messy. But I want to encourage you today, as we look at Jonah today, I want to encourage you to see the grace of God in your mess. To look for the grace of God in the mess that you're in. Whatever it is you're going through. Whatever difficulty or suffering or tragedy or just annoyance maybe that you're going through, look for the grace of God. Because what we're about to read today in Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, what we're about to read today is a picture of the grace of God in the life of Jonah. So if you would, Jonah chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, if you would, please stand in the honor of reading of God's word. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. If you have a different translation, just follow along if you would. But we're going to read verses 4 through 6. It says, "But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went down after him. 'How can you sleep at a time like this?' he shouted. 'Get up and pray for your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives.'" May God bless the reading of his word. I know that's a short reading. There's an old Steve Camp song that makes me think about this, and we'll get there eventually. But the title, Steve Camp was very blunt. He was a disciple of Keith Green. But the title of his song was "Hell is Burning While the Church Sleeps." He didn't sell. I don't know how many records the guy sold, but some of his were like that. But I just remember that song. But Jonah, when we look at this passage, Jonah had been disobedient. He had been disobedient to God, right? Remember last week we talked about this. Jonah, I believe, was in a time of prayer with the Lord, and he was probably asking the Lord, God, what is it you want me to do with my life? What is it you want me to do? And God said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get up where you're at, stop praying, and I want you to go to Nineveh. And remember what we decided was Jonah's response was, not there. Don't ask me to do that. I mean, it's almost like when somebody says, hey, I'll serve anywhere in the church, and say, okay, will you go serve in the nursery? Not there. Right? But with Jonah, that's what was going on. He says, not there, not them, not that place. I don't want to go there. That's not what I want to do. That's not my desire. So Jonah decided to go buy a ticket on a ship, and he takes this ship, and he's like, I want to go to Tarshish. And what we discovered was Tarshish was on the other side of the Mediterranean. It was as far away from, it was one of the farthest points of the known world. He's like, if I can just get as far away from God as I possibly can, I'll be all right. He's like, I'm just going to get as far away as I can. So he gets on this ship, and he goes. And so he's disobedient to God. God has told him to do one thing, and he's done something totally different. This happens to us. Jonah has been disobedient to God, and because of that, here's some things that happen. One, he stops hearing the voice of God. I want you to understand something. When you are disobedient to God, you will stop hearing God's voice. And Jonah stopped hearing God's voice. Listen, God was no longer speaking directly to Jonah. Jonah gets on the ship. The last thing God told him to do, Jonah didn't do that. And now he's in disobedience. So he goes and gets on this ship, and he's not hearing God. God is now using other things and other people to get his attention. Now I want you to know, he'll do this to us. Listen to me. He used the storm. Think about this for a second. Nature obeyed God, and Jonah didn't. Isn't that about right? Isn't that about the way things seem to come about a lot of times? Is God will tell us to do something, and we'll tell God, talk to the hand, right? I don't want to hear it. But man, God speaks to the nature, and nature just does what it does by his command. How about this one? How about this? Listen. He used sailors. God didn't speak directly to Jonah. He used sailors to speak to him. It says here, he even got rebuked by pagans in the middle of it. He tells, these guys come to him and says, man, we're crying out to our God. Why aren't you crying out to yours? So here, somebody else speaking to him. So he stopped hearing God's voice. The second thing that happened to Jonah is he stopped caring about God's plan. Jonah was asleep. Jonah was asleep. While everyone else panicked, he was asleep. While they lost everything, he was asleep. Jonah didn't care about them. He only cared about himself. And I want to tell you something. When we begin to be disobedient to God, we begin to stop caring about his plan. And we only begin to think about ourselves, what's mine and what's ours and what's going to happen to me, right? That begins to happen when we begin disobedient to God. We begin thinking about ourselves. Now, when I think about Jonah going down and going to sleep, I think about a story in Matthew chapter 8 where another storm took place. Another storm took place, and this storm was a little bit different. This storm took place that Jesus and his disciples got into this boat, and they're going to go to the other side of the lake. They're going to go to the other side of the sea. And while they're in the boat, a storm comes about. Do you remember the story? A storm comes. And man, what are they doing? They're panicking. They're just flipping out. They don't know what to do. They're scared. And where's Jesus at? He's asleep. So we got two different kinds of things going on here. We have Jonah, and he's what? Asleep. And we have Jesus, and he's asleep. Now, let's compare a couple of things here. And there's a difference between these two storms. One, Jonah was in a storm because of his disobedience. I want you to understand something. There are storms that will come into your life, and it's because of your disobedience. It's called the results of sin. Those things will happen in your life. There are storms that will come into your life because of your disobedience. Second thing is, but the disciples, listen, the disciples were in a storm because they were following Jesus. Hear me. There are storms that are going to come into your life because you're following Jesus. I mean, we got to learn how to discern the two, don't we? Because sometimes it's out of our obedience and sometimes it's out of our disobedience. Storms are still going to come. Second, Jonah was asleep because he didn't care. He didn't care. And so in his disobedience, he went to sleep because he didn't care about what was going on. Jesus was asleep because he was in charge. Whole lot better to be in a storm following Jesus than be in a storm running from him. Y'all all right? I mean, if you're in a storm following him, you know, and he's asleep, man, it's because he's not worried. It's not that he don't care. He's just in charge. But now listen, but if you get into a storm because you're being disobedient to him, man, you're in a storm. Third thing, he stopped going before God's presence. This is what happens when we begin to disobey God. He stopped going before God's presence. The one person who knew the God who could get them out of this mess could care less. Man, when we're disobedient to God, man, we begin to be like that. We quit going before God. We quit praying. Jonah lost his power in prayer. He lost his desire to pray. The pagan sailors called on their gods, but not Jonah on his God. You know, they were worshiping, but Jonah wasn't worshiping. You know, I understand something. Listen to me. The disobedient follower of Jesus, you end up stopping worshiping because you're supposed to be worshiping the one true God. We're supposed to be worshiping God, but when we're disobedient, we stop worshiping him. But I want you to understand something. The rest of the world continues on worshiping their idols. And they're wondering why you're not worshiping yours. So he stopped praying. He stopped seeking the presence of God. He stopped sharing about God's grace. There was a distance between Jonah's confession and his practice. When we become disobedient to God, what we say we believe about God, we begin, listen, there'll be a distance now between what we say we believe and what we actually do. Sin will make you forget who you are and who you belong to. Disobedience does that. Your confession may be true, but it needs to be backed by your obedience. I want to say this, and because I'm guilty of it in my own life, and listen, I always have to have every once in a while, you got to have a check. Okay, you want to check some things off in your life. Here's a good one. Listen, one of the sure signs you are far from God is when you stop talking about Jesus. Jonah got on the boat. And he never taught, the only thing he told him, he was running away from his God. And that's the only thing he said. He wasn't going to talk about his God, though. He quit talking. Listen, he was a prophet. What was his job? To tell people about God. To tell people what God was going to do. And he was running away from him. As a follower of Jesus, let me ask you something. What's your job? To talk about Jesus, to tell people. But when we're disobedient, listen, we're not going to. Matter of fact, that's going to be the furthest thing from our mind. We're going to be like, man, I want to make sure I'm trying to get somewhere else. So those are just some signs of disobedience. And Jonah was a long way from God, wasn't he? He was disobedient. He needed God's uncomfortable grace. Now, I want to talk to you about that. I want to talk to you about the uncomfortable grace of God. Because, see, our picture of grace a lot of times is that feel-good stuff, isn't it? Man, amazing grace. I love that sound. It's so good. I love amazing grace. It sounds so good to me. Don't we? Don't we love that? We like to embrace it. It makes us feel good, doesn't it? I want you to understand something. There's an uncomfortable side of grace. And Jonah was about to experience uncomfortable grace. Uncomfortable grace. Jonah 1:4 says, the Lord hurled a great wind on the sea, and there was a great storm on the sea, so that the ship was about to break up. Listen to me. God's anger has been stirred up against Jonah. because Jonah has just been disobedient to God. God's anger has been stirred up against Jonah. This is a bad storm. I need you to understand something. Sailors who have been on the sea and have navigated those waters don't freak out like these guys did unless it was a bad one. So, God's serious here. He got real serious with Jonah. Man, he stirred something up that was a big deal. God was saying, Jonah, you run from me, watch what I do. How many of you have had that kind of anger toward your children? You disobey me, look what I'm about to do. Right? Tell me you don't have that response with your kid. And you didn't have that response with your kids at one time. You watch what I'm about to do. Throw one more rock and see what happens. God is not happy with Jonah. Not happy with him at all. I'm sitting here thinking about disobedience and thinking about, man, I don't know about y'all, but the one person in my house when I was growing up, I didn't want the wrath of was my mama. I did not want mama's wrath. It was coming. It was coming too, and you knew it. It was like, man, my mom, listen, I want you to understand, my mom didn't have to touch me. She just had to look. Has anybody ever got the look? And don't get that look in church either. It's like it'd be doing something. Man, that look will run you out the back door. It's like, some of you now got that look already. It's like, you're thinking about it. We don't like to talk about the anger of God, do we? See, the anger of God is like that embarrassing uncle at the wedding. It's what we don't want to talk about. That's a side of God we don't like to talk about. Matter of fact, when we begin to share about God with people, we want to talk about his good side. We want to talk about the love, how good God is love, God is grace, God, it's all about hope, it's all about good. Can I get you to understand something? I want you to hear something. You can't talk about that stuff unless you also talk about the anger of God and the wrath of God. Because see, all that stuff doesn't exist unless there's another side. And I'm talking about uncomfortable grace. And so we don't like to admit that part about God, but we don't want, listen to me, we don't want to live in a world where the one who is in charge of it is incapable of anger. You don't want to live in that world. It would be a world with no justice. How many know we need justice in our world today? We need God's justice. I want to tell you something. I am so unnerved and so upset about the amount of human trafficking in our world right now. Listen, guys, we have a worldwide slavery epidemic right now. And if you think if you think that it is isolated in Europe and South and Africa and other parts of the world, you're wrong. It's in Wilmington. It's down the road from your, listen, it's not too far from us. It's a real deal. Listen, we want God to be angry about that. We want God to be angry about children and girls being sold into slavery. We want God to be angry about that. Because listen, it's not okay. We want a God who is angry about that. We want a God, listen, if we didn't have a God who was angry about those things, there'd be no justice, but there'd also be no mercy. There'd be no mercy without that. We wouldn't be able to experience grace. This world would be unlivable if we didn't have a God who was angry about these things. The anger of God, listen, is our hope in both life and death. Without God's anger over sin, there would be no hope for any of us. Because without God's anger over his sin, there would be no cross. There'd be no cross. And it's at the cross, listen to me, it's at the cross where God's anger and God's grace, God's love, God's compassion, listen, it's where they embrace. They embrace one another there. The anger of God and the love of God embrace one another at the cross. The anger of God. The anger of God toward Jonah, though, is what we call redemptive anger. I want you to understand, God does have there are other types of anger that are found in Scripture, but in this case, we're talking about redemptive anger. God wants Jonah to obey him. So God does something in his life, and the reason why God brings this storm is he's saying, Jonah, I want you to come back to me. I need you to understand something. There are sometimes God's going to bring stuff in your life, and it's because he wants you to come back to him. That's a good thing. When people are far from the Lord and far from God, you want those things. You want God to want them to come back to him. The reality is this. God could have said, Jonah, okay, drown. I mean, he could have. He could have just said, I'm done with you, Jonah. And when he threw him in the sea, he didn't have to provide a fish to save him. He could have just let him die. But he had some uncomfortable grace there. The storm that God sent was an agent of God's uncomfortable grace. God will break up what we put our confidence in if our confidence is not in him. Jonah, if you remember, we talked about this. He bought a ticket and got on a boat, and he was heading on. And it says this, that the storm, when it came, began to break up the ship. Now, I don't know about you guys. I get uncomfortable being on a boat anyway. You know, Leslie and I went on a cruise a while back, and the only thing I could think of, honestly, I was just like, I just walked around the ship a lot just to be distracted, because I could only think of was like, man, I saw the movie The Titanic. I don't care that we're in the Caribbean. I really don't. I know what happens. It doesn't end well. Matter of fact, the male hero of the movie, he dies. I'm just saying. And he's on that boat, man, and that storm hits, and it begins to fall apart. You know? Like that little cartoon where there's a hole in the boat. It's like, trying to keep the water from coming in. The ship, it was the ship, listen to me. It was the ship that took Jonah away from God. It was the ship that was his way of getting away from God. It was the ship that Jonah was trusting in for his life. He was no longer trusting in God. He was like, this ship is going to keep me safe from Nineveh. The ship is going to protect me. And God was going to take away the ship. There was two areas that I've seen this happen with us in our own lives, and I want you to understand something. There's so many areas. There are areas in our lives where we're just like, you know what? God says do this, and we're not going to do it, and we're going to trust in that. And I want you to understand, God will bring storms in your life to break those things up. And I want to tell you, there's two areas that I see it often, over and over and again, and that's finances and listen, finances and friendships. God will break stuff up in your life because he wants you to come back to him. He'll cause possessions to go away if they become more important than God. He'll cause them to go away. Listen, he'll affect your finances so that you have to depend on him. He'll take people out of your life that you thought were real important to you because they have become idols in your life. He'll do that. He's done it to me. I remember before I met Leslie, I mean, we've talked about this before, and she's gone through it too. When we were single, man, and all of a sudden, when we would think we had fallen in love, and we were dating the person we thought, and all of a sudden, that person became more important than God. And it wasn't long before God said, "So that's more important? I'll pull them out of your life. You're going to go through a storm." I was sitting in a Sunday school class years ago up in Statesville, North Carolina. I went and visited this church with a friend and went to Sunday school class with them. And Sunday school teacher was sharing about finances, and he was sharing about giving, sharing about tithing. And he began to share. He said, this was his story, it was his testimony. I thought it was awesome. He said, for years, he says, I didn't give. He says, I didn't give to the Lord. I was disobedient. He said it was like 11 years. And for 11 years, he withheld his giving to God. As a believer in Jesus, he withheld his giving for 11 years. Well, he was the owner of a nursing home. And here's how God got his attention. A lawsuit came against his nursing home. Guess how much the lawsuit that he lost ended up being? 10% of 11 years of income. God came and got what he wouldn't give. Listen to me. And when we're disobedient, God will find a way to get it. It might be, listen, I'm going to tell you something. I'm not saying that giving is going to protect you from financial decline, but I want to tell you something. It's going to make you, listen, you're going to be trusting in God and not your finances. And listen, and when the finances go away, you're trusting God a lot more. But when you're holding on so tight to relationships, or you're holding on so tight to those finances that they become more important to you than God, when those things when those things disappear, listen to me, those become painful storms. But when those things go, when God is your focus, when God is the one, when you know that God is your source, when you know that God is the one that you're focused on, when you know that God is the one you're following, when those things disappear, you realize that, listen, that stuff's gone, but the source is not. And that's the difference. The storm you are in right now may be a sign of God's passionate pursuit of you. I don't know what you're going through. The storm that Jonah was in was God's way of saying that he loved Jonah. I think about that with our children. Children disobey us, and then we have to do what? We have to discipline. Well, I want you to understand, for a child, that discipline is a storm. It's a storm in their life. It's a difficult thing in their life. But that storm, listen, that discipline is not because we hate that child, but it's because we love that child. And we are going after them because we don't want them to fall further into sin, because we love them. And that's what's happening here with God and Jonah. He is pursuing Jonah. All the ways that Jonah used to turn away from God, this is good, would not stop God from running after Jonah. Listen, it doesn't matter how everything. Jonah would buy a ticket on the ship, and he would try to go there, and he would try to go to sleep, but that didn't stop God. It didn't stop God from chasing after him. God was a whole lot bigger than the Mediterranean Sea that Jonah was trying to cross. We should always be glad when God chases after us. We should be glad when he won't leave us alone. God will interrupt our self-centeredness. God will use things in our lives to get us to stop doing what we're doing. You ever notice that? God will use things in our lives to get us going where he wants us to go, too. I want you to understand, God's messed me up that way sometimes. I wanted to go one way. He said, no, I want you to go this way. And I still tried to go that way and ended up going that way anyway. Sometimes God will send a storm into your life. It may be a storm that is because you are walking with Him, but it may be a storm because you're walking away from Him. But I want you to understand this. He'll send that storm in your life, but it will be His uncomfortable grace. It'll be His uncomfortable grace. It may be in a form of suffering or sadness or separation. Don't get mad at God because of the storm. It just may be His uncomfortable grace at work in your life. Or it may be His uncomfortable grace in the life of someone near you. Do you understand that Jonah wasn't the only one affected by the storm? God's uncomfortable grace, listen, came running after Jonah. And in the middle of that, these pagan sailors worshiping other gods, God was also coming after them. And in the end, they began to acknowledge Jonah's God as the one true God. Second thing I want to point out to you today is this. The world, from the life of Jonah here, the world is waiting for us to be salt and light. The world is waiting for us to be witnesses to God's goodness. Look at verses 5 and 6. It says, then the sailors became afraid, and every man cried to his God. And they threw the cargo which was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone below into the hold of the ship, lain down and fallen sound asleep. So the captain approached him and said, how is it that you are sleeping? Get up, call on your God. Perhaps your God will be concerned about us so that we will not perish. Our disobedience can cost other people. Jonah's sin affected more than Jonah. Your sin affects more than you. Listen, I want you to hear me. When you sin, you can affect other people. Here's proof. Ask a spouse after their spouse has had an affair if someone else's sin doesn't affect them. It does. If you think your sin is only about you and nobody's going to get hurt, you're wrong. Your sin affects other people. Especially when listen, I want you to understand, as followers of Jesus, your sin affects the entire body of Christ. And Jonah's sin affected them. Man, they lost their cargo. And I'm not sure where their destination was and what that cargo was, but could you imagine the wrath that they're going to face when they get to the other side of where they were going? They don't have what they left the other port with. And they have to say, well, man, there was this guy that bought a ticket on our ship, and he wasn't obeying his God, and so we started throwing our cargo into the sea, and then he finally told us to throw him into the sea. And they're like, well, why didn't you do that first? We don't know. We were just trying to save the ship, and they were like, well, I think we got a problem here, and I don't know what happened. Maybe they said, you know what, you're not going to be working for us anymore. Or they may have said, you know what, you're going to work for us, and you're going to work very hard for us because of that happening. And so Jonah's sin affected their lives. And that can happen in our own lives. Our culture, listen, the other thing out of this is our culture is in the middle of a storm of God's grace and doesn't know it. See, these other passengers on this boat were in a panic. This storm had come upon them. They were in full-blown freak-out mode, right? I mean, it was bad. As we talked, they were throwing stuff overboard. I see this happening in our culture right now, is that we have this dependency upon wealth and our identity and on pleasure, and man, we'll just throw everything out there. Anything we can when things start going crazy in our life, we're running to these things. They run to pleasure, they run to the casinos, they run to the lottery or whatever it is. They run to whatever they got to run to because panic has set in on our life, and they're trying to find something to depend on. They're still looking for a bailout. They just don't understand that it's the anger of God trying to draw them to Him. It's that uncomfortable grace of God that God's trying to do it, and they're running to these things, and they're in full-blown freak-out mode, and they begin throwing everything overboard. They begin calling on their own gods. They run to the horoscope, or they run to Oprah, or they call their therapist. Go call the therapist. Get the therapist online. Let me go see what they can tell me. They're trying everything to find hope. Seeking it in relationships, in money, and in addictions. It's heartbreaking, the depths that they'll go. See, we the church, when we look at our culture, because I want to tell you something, I look at our culture and there's some frustration. I don't know about you guys, I'm very frustrated with our culture. I'm frustrated with America right now. I'm frustrated I'm frustrated with decisions that are being made that in our culture with lifestyles and things like that. I'm frustrated that nobody, listen, I'll be real, listen to me. I'm frustrated that it doesn't bother some people about men being in women's restrooms. I'm frustrated that it doesn't bother people about men showering with women in public places. I'm frustrated that it doesn't bother people. But I want you to understand something. I want you to hear me about this, because we the church need to be careful. We don't need to yes, we should be angry because God is angry, and I agree with that, but we can't get mad at our culture. We need to weep for our culture. It ought to break our heart. I mean, they're falling apart. We should weep for our culture. They are doing because think about this, they're only doing what they know to do. What do sinners do? Sin. Sinners sin. They are in the middle of what God is doing. They don't even know it. We need to show them grace. We need to show them that all the stuff that's going on in life and how they're trying to fix it with their identity and with their pleasures and with their stuff, and how they're trying to meet these needs in their life with everything. But God, listen, we need to show them that listen, the reason why you're going through all this is not so you run to all this other stuff. The reason why you're going through all this is that God is coming after you with His uncomfortable grace. And He's chasing them down. And it's our responsibility to show them His uncomfortable grace. It's time for the church to wake up. It's time for us to wake up. Jonah had gone down below into the hold of the ship, and he went to sleep. And one of the first things that was said to him was, wake up, get up. Don't you see that our lives are falling apart? Jonah went down to the bottom of it. It's a picture of his disobedience. He kept going further. Listen, he tried to get far away from God, and then he went down further away from God and away from culture and away from what God had called him to. And he was asleep, and he was told to wake up. Jonah was not just asleep physically, though. He was asleep spiritually. God used unbelievers to wake him up. They came in and said, what are you doing? Jonah was ignoring the trouble the ship was in. Jonah was asleep while their lives were being torn apart. And if we're not careful, we'll be asleep while the lives of our neighbors and our friends and our family and our culture is being torn apart. If we're not careful, we'll be asleep. We're like Jonah. And God has said, go. He's saying, go make disciples of all nations and baptize them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. He said, and you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And I want you to understand something. God is saying that to each and every one of us this morning, that we're to share Jesus with people. We're to speak his name. And when we're disobedient to that, it's as though we are sleeping while their lives are being torn apart, because we have the hope that they need. Matthew 5:13 says, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Here's the hope. Here's the hope in all this. The hope is in you. It's in you. Colossians 1:27 says this, to whom God willed to make known what is the riches of the glory of this mystery among the Gentiles, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory. 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. You carry the hope that this culture needs. You carry that. The hope of this world is God's uncomfortable grace. And that grace is found at the cross of Jesus Christ. It's found there. And that grace is found where God's anger and God's love for humanity embrace. And that is the cross. So, if you're far from God today, maybe you've been disobedient to him, maybe you're running from him, I want you to know, I believe he's pursuing you. I don't believe he ever stopped pursuing you. I believe he keeps coming after you. He might be using a storm in your life. He might be using difficulty or suffering. He might be using somebody else to get your attention. He might be using me this morning. I don't know. If you're seeking him, I want you to know that God is calling you. And he's calling you to be salt and light. He's calling you to carry the hope that this world needs. To give them hope. Because their lives are falling apart. And they need us. The people around us need us. They need you. Because of what God's done in you. They need you. I want you to know that today. Those sailors needed Jonah to be a follower of God, and he wasn't. Nineveh is sitting there waiting on Jonah to get there because Nineveh needed Jonah. Oak Island needs Shoreline Church. Southport needs Shoreline. Brunswick County needs Shoreline. North Carolina needs Shoreline. Your Shoreline. The United States needs Shoreline. I want you to understand the world needs Shoreline. The world needs you because you carry the hope of the world inside of you because of what Jesus has done in and through you.